Let's weld some spikes to the power armor and fire up the demon engines, because today we're talking Chaos Space Marines in 9th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video we're going to be doing a bit of a general faction overview for the Chaos Space Marines, an army that's really not seen all that much love or support from Games Workshop so far in 9th, and despite having a whole ton of different and varied options, they're certainly desperate to get a new and revamped codex. In the video we're going to be doing a bit of an overview of Chaos Marines in game, starting with their performance, strengths and weaknesses of the faction. Then in turn we'll go over their core rules, some of the best things their various legions can have to offer, some of the strong rules from the core book, a quick talk over their various datasheets, how they might ally in 9th, and finish up with a few example army lists. Absolutely loads to talk about here, so let's jump straight in. So in general, Chaos Space Marine armies in 9th haven't really had it all that easy. I think when the initial switch to 9th was made, they were kind of middling in strength. Certainly some interesting builds and combos amongst their many options, but clearly not exactly top tier compared with some of the other biggest threats. Certainly as 9th edition has rolled out, it's kind of only got worse for the Chaos Marines. The new codexes are generally stronger than them, and they're a bit more of a challenge to win with at events right now. They may be propped up a little bit by Chaos allies, there's quite a bit of good cross-codex synergy, and the different Chaos factions can cover each other's weaknesses to some extent. The best performing Chaos Marine lists quite often include allies in some form. I'd say perhaps for the biggest strengths of the faction, there's really quite a lot of Legion and God specific options. A World Eater's Chaos Marine list will function quite differently to an Alpha Legion one, and having a bunch of extra warlord traits, relics and stratagems for each of their legions does mean that you can really build different style Chaos lists that really emphasize different units. Quite a few of their datasheets can be a little bit on the pricey side for what they do, but they are quite able to focus a serious amount of buffs on certain big hitter units by layering things like stratagems, prayers, rerolls, and powerful psychic powers. You could have units shooting with +1 to hit, rerolling 1s, firing twice, and all at +1 to wound for some absolute carnage in the shooting phase, for example. It's also made easier by their buffing characters not being limited by core, and quite a few of their stratagems being written for early in 8th edition, when Games Workshop wasn't quite so good at spotting what things would be a bit rubbish and what things would be really quite powerful. Being able to casually shoot twice for 2 command points on Slanesh infantry units is seriously good stuff. On the downside, I think that quite a lot of Chaos players feel like they're kind of in limbo in 9th edition. We know there's a whole bunch of basic changes coming, including +1 wounds on troops and terminators, and changes to the datasheets that we've seen in the Thousand Suns and Death Guard codexes. It is kind of annoying to know the things that will be coming, but not to have access to them because the book isn't out. Probably the biggest weakness is that quite a lot of datasheets just aren't really all that points efficient, maybe partly kept so because of the amount of buffs that can be applied to them, because if Chaos had some incredibly points efficient datasheets, maybe the buffs that they could apply to them could just make them absolutely crazy. I think this is a bit of a downside though, because if you're forced to use a cluster of buffing characters to make most of the units worth it, it's just quite a bit limiting with playstyle and where you can position the units on the board. So let's talk through a few of the core rules for Codex Chaos Space Marines. Firstly, they all get malicious volleys and hateful assault, being able to rapid fire their bolters out to 24 inches if they're either still or are terminators, and +1 attack on the charge or the first round of combat. The volleys are pretty useful on combi bolters, and hateful assault ensures that most units are at least somewhat dangerous in melee. Next we have Death to the False Emperor, the extra attacks on 6s to hit when you're in melee with Imperium units. Maybe a slightly minor buff this one, but it does mean that occasionally your damage can just get crazily high if you do roll a fair few 6s. It's certainly no bad thing to have in melee if you are fighting the followers of the Corpse Emperor. Then we have the Legion traits, basically this Chaos Space Marine version of Chapter Tactics. I'd say compared with quite a lot of the armies in the game, the Legion traits themselves are kind of weak. They haven't been rewritten since the first codex came out towards the start of 8th edition, and they're also kind of limited in that they don't apply to vehicles or cultists. In particular, not getting them on vehicles does seem a bit silly to me, kind of an arbitrary limitation. I'd say perhaps the bigger reason to pick one legion over the other are for the options of stratagems and warlord traits and things that they get, and I think that these might alter the way you play a bit more than the actual passive bonuses that you get. Chaos units can take some god-specific icons. For me, probably the best are the Icon of Wrath for re-rolling charges for Khorne units, or potentially the Icon of Excess for some better Death to the False Emperor if you happen to take Slanesh. I'd say both are a little bit take or leave really. The Death to the False Emperor one does seem reasonable enough if you are taking it on a really big melee unit of Slanesh Nasties. Most of the units in the book get to choose a Chaos mark to unlock certain synergies and stratagems for the units. For example, Khorne units can opt to fight twice for 3 command points in the fight phase, or Slaanesh infantry units can shoot twice with Endless Cacophony for 2 CP. Quite a good reason to have most of your shooting units be Slaanesh, and it can be quite helpful for targeting them with certain psychic powers, such as the powerful Delightful Agonies. Finally, Demon Engines have a bit of a subset of synergies all of their own, things like certain buffs from Masters of Possession or Lord Discordants only working on them, and you can certainly justify a bit of a Demon Engine contingent with some overlapping buffs working on a lot of them. Next, I thought we'd talk through the Traitor Legions, which ones are having the most success right now, and some of the strongest things that you can bring from each of them. In competitive play at the moment, the most successful lists often tend to build around either Emperor's Children or Iron Warriors, or maybe even a combo of the two, though most of the others all have some showings as well. Emperor's Children locks you down the Slaanesh route, which isn't too bad for the fights first, Endless Cacophony, and Delightful Agonies that go with that. I think maybe the biggest reasons to play Emperor's Children, though, are Troops Choice Noise Marines for some powerful damage dealers to go with all those synergies, and in particular you could think about buffing them with their Remnant Relic for some full-on reroll wound rolls for a shooting phase to make them extra dangerous on the Alpha Strike. Emperor's Children also seem to be the preferred legion for things like Lightning Claw Terminator squads. They can get some incredibly reliable charges from Deep Strike, and when they get into melee there's a few interesting combat buff stratagems that they can also put on top of them. Otherwise, if you're going for a bit more of a vehicle-related approach, the Iron Warriors really seem to have come into their own in 9th, with quite a few people building vehicle-related lists around them, often including some Forge World models. Ignore's Cover certainly isn't bad for a shooting-orientated list, but I think perhaps one of the single most powerful things that they bring is the option to trade 1 command point for 3 wounds on any damaged vehicle, which is likely to add up to a serious amount of healing over the course of the game. They've also got a kind of useful Feel No Pain stratagem, Tank Hunters to utterly destroy one enemy vehicle, and an option to make one of your units extra resistant to enemy AP, which is a very nice pop-up defensive buff. They've got a couple of nice relics, including Insidium to basically just make one character stronger and tougher, can't really go too wrong with that, and some fun mecha tendrils that can add up to a serious amount of mortal wounds. One of the biggest benefits of Iron Warriors though is the Demon Smith Warlord trait, which is a pretty spectacular shooting buff. Any Demon Engine shooting within 6 inches will get exploding 6s to hit, so an extra hit for every hit roll of a 6. That's often a boost of shooting by 33% to every single model that it affects, so it's really quite nice. Iron Warriors are a pretty decent choice if you're going with Demon Engines, Decimators, the Lord of Skulls or Lord's Discordant, or basically just about anything else vehicle related. Otherwise, every other Traitor Legion certainly has its reasons to sell it. I find most of Black Legion's choices just a touch underwhelming. I'd say Abaddon himself is maybe the biggest reason to run them, though you can make a fairly fun Chaos Lord build with one of their relic chainswords. The Word Bearers are basically all about their possessed and their priests, perhaps best employed for some big synergies around some huge possessed squads, making them extra tough or extra fighty with damage 2 attacks, and their Dark Apostles can be far better by casting 2 prayers per turn. World Eaters basically add up to massive combat damage. Their Red Butcher's Terminators fighting twice can be particularly fun. They don't see an absolute ton of competitive play right now, but I'm sure there'd be a real blast to command with a serious amount of carnage unleashed in every fight phase. Night Lords I'd say perhaps might be one of the weaker Chaos Legions. Their morale shenanigans can be fun, but quite a lot of armies don't really care all that much. They might be best off building around some Raptors and Warp Talons, and maybe unleashing Vox Scream to mess with enemy characters. Finally, for the main legions, besides the Death Guard and Thousand Sons who have their own books, the Alpha Legion get -1 to hit throughout at range, and that is really quite useful against ranged armies. And I must admit I am a big fan of the Alpha Legion stratagems, plenty of really disruptive ones on a fairly shooty Chaos Marine list. It doesn't end there though, as you can also field the army as creations of Bile, leading some stronger melee monstrosities into battle alongside Bile himself, though I think in general other combat legions do what they do a bit better, I'm afraid. Fallen don't really have much incentive to take them at the moment. Their one datasheet is a touch on the weak side and they really don't have much support. And then there's a few Renegade Legion traits, far less support than the other Traitor Legions, though some of their options are interesting. You can get a few more command points from Red Corsairs, some pretty hefty shooting buffs from the Purge, and the Flawless Host can build some very nasty characters, particularly Lord Discordants. There really are a massive amount of ways that you could potentially build Chaos Space Marines, and I do suspect we'd see a few more of these explored a bit more by competitive lists if their base datasheets were a bit more impressive. Leaving the Legion-specific rules to one side for now, let's talk through the other strong rules from the core Chaos Codex. These are just a small selection of the choices that I think are more likely to make it into lists than some of the others. For warlord traits, I think perhaps one of my favourites are the Flames of Spite. For something like a lord with dual lightning claws who can get a lot of attacks, that could add up to a serious amount of damage in the combat phase, particularly with things like Veterans of the Long War, to get those mortal wounds going off on a 5+. Otherwise, Warp Lord seems like a fairly reasonable one for some more reliable psychic powers. For relics, if you're taking a smash character, maybe a Khorne one, then the Talisman of Burning Blood can certainly increase your threat range. Being able to advance and charge is very nice indeed, and rerolling charges on top of that is a bonus. Otherwise, there's an absolute ton of different options for various boosted melee weapons, plenty of which could give you a little bit of extra combat punch. Psychic powers for the Chaos Space Marines I think are very solid indeed, and unless you're playing World Eaters, I'd say more Chaos armies than don't tend to include either a Sorcerer or Master of Possession. Death Hex can be truly game-changing to remove invuls at a key point. Prescience is a nice reliable +1 to hit to amp up a shooting unit. Warp Time is a near auto-include, getting your units exactly where they need to be, and potentially guaranteeing you that you get to strike the enemy before they hit you back, just because of the crazy threat range that certain units can have with this. Each of the god-specific powers amps up durability. Maybe Delightful Agonies is the best for that 5+ feel no pain. It's good on most things, though particularly on Chaos Terminators with their multi-wounds. And if you're taking a Master of Possession along, either to buff some possessed or demon engines, I'd certainly be picking up Cursed Earth for the boosted invul saves to make them really hardy, and likely Infernal Power for reroll ones to hit and wound as well. That one's got great value. For the Dark Apostles, I think that most of their prayers are pretty handy. An aura of 5+ invuls is great on anything that's got a 3+ save or worse, or you can just make one really big heavy hitting unit -1 to hit. Not bad when you could put that on something like a Lord of Skulls or something. Otherwise you can either amp up range or melee damage, either with +1 to hit rolls when you're shooting, or +1 to wound in melee. I think all of those can be usable in the right list. Finally, for some of the stronger stratagems, it'd be kind of rude not to start with Veterans of the Long War for 1 command point. 1 CP for +1 to wound is going to be handy almost wherever it's put. I'd expect to be using that near enough every turn to amp up damage. Demon Forge is also a crazy buff to any demon engines you might have. 4 rerolls to hit and wound just for 1 command point is pretty mad, and again easily one that you could use every turn if you wanted to. I quite like the option of the Chaos Familiar to switch powers, so you could suddenly shift into Death Hex or something if you needed to remove some invuls, and if you have a Sorcerer with the Mark of Tzeentch, then you could cast an extra power as well. I think that Tide of Traitors is a really powerful one for Chaos Cultists, 2 command points to replenish the squad, but perhaps more importantly to gain movement. Maybe jump a big squad over to a lightly defended enemy home objective and maybe rest it off them for a turn or two, or even just to jump around the board and do secondary objectives like retrieve Octarius data. This one's just really quite a good value one. Finally, for all the Slanesh units out there, 2 command points for Endless Cacophony to fire again. Certainly one of the stratagems that makes the big Chaos death stacks of buffs most viable. You can buff a unit with rerolls, prayers and things, Veterans of the Long War for +1 to wound, and then with Endless Cacophony not just get that buff shooting once, but get it twice. It's really solid on very big units of Noise Marines, though things like Havocs, Terminators or Obliterators could also make great use. Maybe the main advantage of Chaos stratagems is just the easy way that you can convert them into raw damage so easily. Moving on, let's take a quick talk through the various datasheets in Codex Chaos Space Marines. We'll start out with the squads and foot units. First up, it's a bit sad that the standard Chaos Space Marines are maybe some of the most underwhelming out of the lot here. With just having the 1 wound and reasonably low damage output, they're just a tiny bit underwhelming for what they do. People seem to prefer cultists for the objective holding and actions role, though cheap units of Chaos Space Marines could certainly do that if you wanted to. I think perhaps people are drawn to the extra bodies that you get with cultists, so they can't just be ruined by a few really powerful shots, and also the Tide of Traitors stratagem to allow them to move around the board if they need to. I think often people are just wanting to save the most amount of points possible on the troops, and plough everything into the more elite units and heavy hitters. For the 4 types of Cult Marines, I have already mentioned them, but Noise Marines certainly get a lot of love. In Emperor's Children, they can also compete for the troops role as well, and being able to be taken in really big units with quite a lot of decent weapons, they are one of the best units to put all of these buffs together on, stacking psychic powers, prayers and auras with Endless Cacophony. Some people seem to like using a Dreadclaw drop pod to get them in range and ensure the alpha strike on the enemy. Berserkers, Plague Marines and Rubric Marines don't seem to be seeing as much play in core Chaos Marine lists. Plague Marines and Rubrics just seem a little bit of an inferior version of the versions you'll get in Death Guard and Thousand Sons, For me, Berserkers are a bit more interesting, mainly because of their really nice fights twice rule, and still having Berserkers charging out of Rhinos certainly can be a scary threat. You certainly don't want to leave any infantry for them to blend anywhere nearby, as they'll go through anything with a low armor save very quickly indeed. For the elite assault troops, Terminators with lightning claws and either combi weapons or combi bolters seem to be a really popular choice, particularly in Emperor's Children where you can deep strike them and get the very reliable charge. They put out some nice generalist shooting that you could use Endless Cacophony on if you wanted to, and then for the points cost with the lightning claws, their damage output really is quite good. Lightning Claw Chosen also seemed like quite a nice choice on paper as well, definitely an interesting option that you could compare to Khorne Berserkers perhaps. There are very similar points, but fewer attacks on the charge, though they do get to re-roll the wound roll and more AP. Again, could be another interesting choice to have charging out of a Rhino. Possessed seem to be a unit that's quite good to either go big or go home on. It's quite nice that they're at least somewhat more tanky than the other Elite's choices, having 2 wounds and a 5+ invul save. It means that they don't fall down quite as easily to return enemy fire compared with some of the others. If you build around them, I think they can get really quite efficient indeed. You could have Possessed with a 4+ invul save from an Infernal Master, loads of rerolls, and damage to attacks in close combat with Word Bearers. Finally, Mutilators don't really tend to see all that much play. They're relatively cheap for their defensive profile, but maybe just don't quite do enough in combat to make them really worth it. For the fast choices, Raptors and Warp Talons do tend to appear in Chaos lists a fair bit. Raptors are really quite cheap skirmishers and fast-moving infantry, pretty good for doing actions and things and getting to grips with light troops holding objectives. Warp Talons pack a fair bit more punch with their lightning claws, but again only having the one wound that Chaos Marines have these days, they're still rather fragile. In general they tend to be both taking a bit more than bikes at the moment, and otherwise in fast attack, Spawn could be a super cheap annoyance unit, only 23 points, and sometimes it can just be good for them to hang around doing something that nothing else wants to, contesting an objective that they're almost certainly going to get killed off, or move blocking or screening deep strike. Finally, getting onto the heavy support, and we have Obliterators, a bit on the pricey side for how much firepower you get, and not really all that tough when they cost the same amount as a battle tank. Potentially could be kind of useful with big overlapping synergy things, and I think they maybe have a bit more of a place in Alpha Legion, where you can use the stratagem to allow them to shoot but not be shot back. Finally, Havocs are maybe in a fairly similar boat, a little bit on the fragile side with only 1 wound, but again can make good use of Endless Cacophony, and the Reaper Chain Cannons are really quite an interesting option, allowing you to spam a serious amount of shots down range. Moving on to the vehicles now, and often a very reasonable choice to head them up is a Lord Discordant, a powerful dangerous vehicle threat in his own right, and also gives buff to nearby demon engines. I think he's quite a good choice for putting any durability relics that you might have on him, or perhaps even warp timing him up for very early charges. Perhaps some of the best battle line vehicles out of the Codex are Venom Crawlers and Defilers. I think they're both decently powerful as a nice mixed threat unit that can do a bit of range and melee. They're particularly nice with that Iron Warrior's Demon Lord Warlord trait for the exploding 6s, and for the points invested they're at least fairly durable. I feel like they maybe outcompete the standard Hellbrute at the moment, who's kind of going for a similar role. Otherwise, Mauler Fiends I think aren't a terrible choice for just spamming up the board as another big annoying threat that your opponent has to deal with. Helldrakes I think have really very underwhelming damage, but their main advantage is perhaps just being very fast so they can get some early charges on things. And of the battle tanks, I think that Land Raiders and Predators are really quite underwhelming for their points cost at the moment. Maybe Vindicators and Forge Fiends might have a bit more of a role, being fairly sturdy ranged threats that can act as a bit of a distraction. I still feel that Venom Crawlers and Defilers, though, are perhaps one of the best vehicle ways to go out of the core codex. Otherwise, Chaos lists can certainly have quite a lot of room for using Rhinos. A fair amount of fairly dangerous combat troops that aren't all that tough means that the extra protection can be good. Combi Melters on top can be useful as well. And interestingly, the Lord of Skulls is perhaps one of the better super heavies currently. Doubly so now it only costs you 1 command point to include them if you're running Chaos Space Marines in the rest of your list. Not all that many people are really building to try and take down massive Toughness 8 Lords of War these days, and the Chaos Dex does give these guys really quite a lot of support. Full rerolls to hit and wound from Demon Forge for a command point, and then things like Veterans of the Long War and some good character buffs thrown in as well, like Psychic Powers. Quite cool to see that they're at least relatively common in some of the better performing Chaos lists. Otherwise, since the Imperial Armour Compendium came out the best part of the year ago, Chaos do have quite a lot of interesting Forge World choices to draw on as well. The Cookie Cutter Volkite Dreadnought with the Culverins always seems to do solid work, though it often seems to be outcompeted by the Chaos Decimator, who with their Soul Burner petards could quite easily be getting 5 or 6 mortal wounds per shooting phase against enemy units. which really isn't too bad at all for an 180 point vehicle that's at least fairly tough to shift with its invul save. Otherwise, the Chaos Leviathans are certainly worth a look. They can get a lot of buffs that the Loyalist ones can't due to not having anything to do with the core keyword. Dreadclaw drop pods can do a nice mix between actually delivering a unit and then being an annoying threat once they're down, and the Terrax pattern termite drill can do similarly, delivering a scary squad and hopefully flattening a vehicle. Finally, we get on to some of the character choices. I'd say quite a few of the Chaos character choices can have some solid use. I'd say perhaps the strongest picks tend to be Sorcerers, Dark Apostles, Masters of Possession and Chaos Lords. Particularly the Psykers I think have great value for the points invested, even if they can sometimes be a bit of a liability in 9th, particularly if you're fighting a psychic heavy army like Thousand Suns or Grey Knights, and Chaos Lords are just a good all-round choice, giving some nice rerolls and often being a nice countercharge threat with jump packs. We've already touched on the Lord Discordant, who's pretty great for leading Demon Engine lists, and otherwise I also think that Warpsmiths can have a similar niche. Demon Princes can be a nice all-rounder, though are a bit pricey for the amount that you pay for them, and if you're playing Black Legion, then Abaddon is almost an auto-include. There's plenty of niche advantages to some of the other special characters, but these are probably the ones that I'd be looking at first. Before we look at a few lists, I thought we'd just touch on Allied Chaos, as I definitely think there's a lot of strength that you can potentially gain if you do want to include demons or other allies. I feel you certainly can play Chaos Space Marines as a big army with lots of overlapping buffs on certain units, though you can certainly just harvest a few of the good bits in a patrol detachment perhaps. Maybe say take a couple of Iron Warrior Decimators alongside a support character, or some Emperor's Children Noise Marines and Lightning Claw Terminators, and you've just scooped up some of the most powerful bits of the faction. You could potentially run multiple legions as well if you wanted to try and keep certain units in a legion that really gives them good synergy. Otherwise though, I think the Chaos Demons are perhaps the biggest win in terms of allies, in particular Chaos Heralds, and in particular the Herald of Slaanesh. If you've got Slaanesh demon units nearby, which it does count as if you've got say a demon engine with the mark of Slaanesh, the Heralds will give them +1 strength innately. They might be able to help them out with things like psychic powers, but most importantly their Locus ability will allow them to advance and charge. It's a seriously powerful buff on things like say a Lord Discordant or a big unit of Possessed, particularly in combination with Warp Time that could get them into melee crazily quickly. Otherwise though, on a more Nurgly side, having some forward deployment screening units and Nurglings are great to pick up, and you could build around things like Epidemius for his tally to make Nurgle units better, though he's probably better off working with Death Guard demon engines on that end. Otherwise you could potentially think about mixing demons and marines with Be'lakor's disciples. Be'lakor's pretty nice in himself, and it could certainly help out some of the more infantry-based Chaos Space Marine units, teleporting them around the battle and giving them buffs. Otherwise, things like Knights, Thousand Suns and Death Guard can certainly fill in gaps in the Chaos Space Marine army. Being able to pick the best out of a couple of codexes is usually a solid thing, though you do give up some significant trade-offs in terms of the Death Guard and Thousand Suns now. Finally, I thought we'd just talk through a few successful army lists, some examples of some lists that people have used to place highly at grand tournaments. First up, we have this Iron Warriors list by John Shaw, who took 4th with it at 90k GT, and it looks like a really good example of the scary demon engines that you can unleash, all centered around some Iron Warriors buffing characters. The list is largely based around a single battalion, there was a small Emperor's Children auxiliary support, and it's headed up by 4 really quite nice buffing characters that can really take the demon engines to the next level. There's a Chaos Terminator Lord with Chain Fist and Combi Melter. He's very hard to shift with the Insidium Relic, bringing him to Toughness 5 and boosting his strength, and as well as his reroll 1s he also grants Demon Smith, the one for the exploding 6s to hit with demon engines. That's going to be absolutely brutal combined with either the Decimators or the Venom Crawlers. There's then a Lord Discordant who gives the nearby demon engines +1 to hit, as well as being very dangerous in himself, and he also takes the pretty nasty Techno-Venomous Mecha Tendrils Relic, which can allow him to deal out a fair few mortal wounds in combat, on top of his already pretty decent abilities. There's then a Master of Possession for Cursed Earth for buffing everyone's invul save, and Infernal Power for rerolls to hit and wound. He's Mark of Tzeentch, so he could cast an extra psychic power if needed. And finally a Greater Possessed with the Mark of Slaanesh, who could be pretty handy to buff the strength of the Venom Crawlers, as it can also help buff their ranged weapon strength. The core of the list are 3 cheap Venom Crawlers, 110 points each, they're pretty efficient for what they do. 3 of these imposing Decimators, 2 with the Soulburner Petards for the crazy amount of mortal wounds, and 1 that's a little bit cheaper with the Butcher Cannons instead. Still quite a nice generalist profile though, and particularly useful against Drukhari Raiders. And finally there's a Leviathan Dreadnought armed with a Grav Bombard, 3 Hunter Killer Missiles, Volkite Calivers, and he packs some powerful anti-charge threat with a siege drill and melter gun. Quite nice to be able to flex into an awful lot of anti-armor damage if they get too close. That battle line core of damage dealers is backed up by a whole bunch of cultists, 2 big units of 20 and 2 units of 10. They'll make sure that any objectives are locked down that need to be, and the big 20 blobs can be annoyingly gated around the table with Tide of Traitors, which could be pretty irritating for enemy units trying to defend battlefield objectives. Finally, and kind of interestingly, in an auxiliary support are a unit of 5 Warp Talons. I'll be honest, I'm not 100% sure what the main objective with these guys is. I believe that they could still use the Emperor's Children 1 CP stratagem to pretty much guarantee the charge out of Deep Strike. That certainly could be really handy, but I must admit it feels a bit steep once you're already essentially paying 2 CP for the auxiliary support. Still though, looks like an incredibly intimidating list to fight. Loads of demon engines backed up by 4+ invul saves, really good support, and healthy applications of Demon Forge and the one to heal 3 wounds on a vehicle per turn should only serve to make this scarier. Next we have a Black Legion example that I talked about on the channel in its own video, so feel free to give that one a search if you'd like to hear a bit more. This one's by Russell Tassin, who used it to take first at Warzone Houston GT, and it's basically a Black Legion list that makes some heavy use of Forge World models. I think it's quite funny that so much of the list seems to revolve around using Abaddon's excellent reroll aura, with a different variety of gun platforms, with 2 Contemptors with the twin las cannons and cyclone missiles, again a Leviathan with a mixed loadout, a single Decimator with the soul burners, a Terrax termite drill, and a massive great big Lord of Skulls to put some serious threat into the midfield. Again there's some cultists to support taking objectives, and another Chaos Lord who takes the Angel's Bane Combi Bolter for yet more shooting. Certainly a very unusual looking Chaos Space Marine list, but quite cool to see someone make Black Legion win. Finally we have a list from earlier in the year by Liam Hackett, who took second at Adelaide Uprising with this, and it's a pretty cool Word Bearers Possessed list. This one really is going all in on the Chaos Big Synergy strategy, taking one of the buffed up Word Bearers Dark Apostles with Benediction of Darkness and Soul Terror Portent, a Master of Possession again for Cursed Earth and Infernal Power, and a Chaos Sorcerer for Delightful Agonies and Warp Time. Those 3 will all be layering their stacked buffs onto 3 absolutely enormous squads of 20 possessed, who can be extra nasty when they're all fighting with damage 2 weapons, and have the chance to be ridiculously hard to shift behind a 4+ invul save and a 5+ feel no pain. Again there's a few squads of 10 cultists, and then there's a small Chaos Demon patrol with Celeste, the very fighty Demon Prince Herald combo, who can let all these possessed advance and charge if needed, and have a good chance to make them fight twice with Hysterical Frenzy. And to round it up there's a unit of 10 Demonettes with an instrument, just to make the patrol work. I do quite like the way that the different legions do incentivize you to build in different ways. You can get some potentially strong Chaos lists with some very different themes. So I think we'll leave that there for today. Hope that's given at least some inspiration for what Chaos Marines can achieve in game right now. They're most certainly waiting with bated breath for their next codex and the buffs that it might bring, but they still do have a fair few diverse and interesting options that they can still bring into battle. Let me know your thoughts, any corrections or feedback down in the video comments. Look forward to hearing any other insights from seasoned Chaos Generals. If you'd like to see more videos like this, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep these regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. And finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel quite a bit, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description below. Making all these videos does take a fair amount of time and effort, particularly really quite big faction summary ones like this. It does take literally hours to make. If you have been enjoying the videos regularly, any support is enormously appreciated. I do try and give as many rewards for patrons as I can, including seeing certain videos early each week, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.